You know, when a teacher is struggling, our first thought is usually what's wrong with them. But what if it's not about the person at all? What if it's a sign that the system itself is broken? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the hidden connection between how we treat our teachers and how well our students actually learn. So, this whole explainer really kicks off with the story of one person, a language teacher in Canada named Miriam El Shafei. And she loved teaching. But, after a few semesters in a part time role, she just felt something was off. Her own teaching was changing, and not in a good way. And then she comes across this research that honestly must have felt like a real gut punch at first. It suggested that students taught by part time teachers actually do worse. But the more she thought about it, the more she looked at her own situation and the pressures she was under, it all started to make a scary amount of sense. And that was the light bulb moment for her. This wasn't about her not being good enough. It was a symptom of something way bigger, a problem with the system itself. Okay, so let's dig into what that system actually is. All right, so first things first. To really get what's going on, we have to talk about the foundation of this whole problem, and it's something called precarious employment. So, what does that even mean? Well, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's work that's insecure, totally unpredictable, and offers almost no protection. Basically, we're talking about the gig workers of the education world. They're hired on short-term contracts, often paid by the hour, and they have none of the stability that comes with a permanent job. And look, this isn't some small niche problem we're talking about. In Canadian English language teaching, a whopping 70% of teachers are hired this way. That's just staggering. They're not the exception to the rule, they are the rule. Okay, to really let that 70% sink in, let's put it in perspective. Across all jobs in Canada, maybe 30% of people are gig workers, but in language education, it's more than double that. So you've got an industry where this unstable, frankly non-committal way of hiring people isn't just common, it's the dominant model. It's wild. So, okay, what does living like this actually do to a teacher? What's the real human cost of all this insecurity? Well, the research paints a pretty grim picture. It's like a cascade of stress. I mean, it starts with the obvious stuff, right? The constant worry about money because the pay is low. But then it just piles on from there. You're juggling multiple jobs to make ends meet. You're doing tons of unpaid work, like grading and lesson planning. You don't get paid sick days. You have few or no health benefits. And on top of all that, you're often totally isolated from your colleagues. It's just a massive weight to carry. And this isn't the kind of stress you can just leave at the office or, the classroom. This kind of job insecurity is directly tied to worse physical and mental health. It spills over into every part of a teacher's life, affecting their well-being and even their family. Okay, and this brings us to the absolute heart of the matter. How does all this private stress a teacher is feeling become a very public problem for their students? So, is a teacher's stress contagious? The research says, oh yeah, absolutely. Think about it. Emotions are contagious, right? A teacher's mood before a class even starts can set the entire emotional tone for the lesson. And what you get is this really clear domino effect. First, that stress gets transferred to the students. A stressed out teacher is going to have a hard time being enthusiastic, and that lack of enthusiasm kills student motivation. Then you've got the practical side. Why would you pour hours and hours of your own unpaid time into crafting the perfect lesson when you don't even know if you'll have a job next semester? And this last one is really critical. The research suggests some teachers might actually lower their standards. They become less demanding to avoid bad reviews from students because a single complaint could mean they don't get their contract renewed. It's a survival tactic. And you can actually see this play out in how teachers teach. When you compare permanent teachers to these contract-based ones, the differences are pretty stark. Permanent teachers, they tend to use a much wider range of teaching strategies. They interact more with students. But the contingent faculty, who are crunched for time and security, are way less likely to use those more intensive, but often more effective, methods like essays with multiple drafts or big group projects. And the support system for students, that breaks down too. These contract teachers are just less available. A lot of them don't have an office, maybe not even a desk on campus. And because they're not paid for any time outside of the classroom, things like office hours become this huge unpaid favor. So if you're a student who needs extra help, you're often out of luck. So what's the end game here? When you add all this up, what is the final measurable cost of this whole chain reaction? For the students, and honestly, for the teaching profession as a whole? Well, the data doesn't really leave much room for doubt. When you look at colleges and universities, the ones that rely heavily on these part-time, insecure teachers, they see lower graduation rates, period. Fewer students stick around, and fewer students end up graduating. Now, you'll often hear official reports say students drop out for personal reasons, but it's really hard to ignore a number like this. In some of these language programs in Canada, where almost all the teachers are gig workers, the dropout rate was over 22%. Let that sink in. That's more than 1 out of every 5 students just not making it through. And it's not just the students who are getting hurt. The system also kind of freezes teachers in place professionally. When you're working in isolation with no support or resources to get better at your job, you can't really grow. You can't collaborate with other teachers, you can't learn new techniques. Your teaching style can end up getting, well, fossilized is the word the research uses. So what do we do with all this? What's the big takeaway? The most important thing to remember is that this is not about pointing fingers at individual teachers. They're just caught in a system that's failing them. And Miriam El-Shafafeh, the teacher we started with, she puts it so perfectly. She says that when these amazing, dedicated teachers work themselves to the bone for their students, it actually lets the institutions off the hook. They get to applaud themselves for doing more with less, and the real human cost of that model just gets completely ignored. So the real solution here isn't to ask already burned out teachers to just try harder. It's actually pretty simple. If you want better outcomes for students, you have to start with better working conditions for teachers. You can't empower students if you don't empower their teachers first. And that really leaves us with one big final question to think about, because this issue goes way beyond just one language program. It forces all of us to ask, what is the true, often invisible cost of trying to do more with less in our schools?